Alright, to get started, I'm using a full 4x8 sheet of maple cabinet ply from my local hardware store. It's roughly around 50 to 55 bucks. What I'm using here is this blue drywall square. It has a perfect straight edge that I can walk around and kind of trace out all the pieces that I'll need, that way to limit the amount of offcuts and amount of waste. Also saving you a bunch of money. So I'm cutting everything with a track saw to break it down to be able to be brought onto my table saw, where I'll be cutting everything to its final dimensions. All right, when breaking up sheets of plywood, you saw me using a track saw. A track saw is simply a fancy version of a circular saw that's allowing you to break up these sheets, create a nice clean cut, and typically it minimizes the amount of tear-outs as well. Now, if you don't have a track saw, that's not a deal breaker when working with finer sheets of cabinet grade plywood. What you can do is take your regular old circular saw, now attaching a nicer blade to it. This is a 60-tooth ultra fine finishing blade from Diablo. It minimizes the amount of tear out and it really works really well. They also have a 24-tooth one. That's specifically if you're gonna work with 2x4s or 2x12s, specifically softer plywood that needs a big, fast, quick cut and then finish up the details later on. So I hope those tips help you guys, and let's get back in the video. Now, I will be uploading everything on my blog in terms of plans, but in the meantime, I'll go over the plans real quick. For the top, it's 36 by 36 inches. The thickness of the top is 2.5 inches. Keep in mind, these are all mitered, so they're not thickness in full. And then the legs or the stem is 12 inches by 12 inches by 18 inches tall. I have a 3 and an almost 6-year-old, so this is a really good appropriate size for them. And then for the base, of course, to prevent wobble, I found that 22 inches by 22 inches by, of course, 2.5 inches thick to match the top prevents and limits the amount of wobble on this table. Now, when it comes to the joinery method on this project, I went a little bit different direction. I decided to use my router table with lift from Craig Tools, and I partnered it up with a Freud miter locking bit. Now, if you're wondering what miter locks are for, they're really, you can avoid using them by just using a table saw. The reason I want to use a miter lock system is if you're going to use a 45-degree angle on your table saw and just put the things together, well, you need to use either A, brad nails, or B, some kind of clamping jig, and it really takes a long time. So with this is a little piece that I kind of cut out and throw away. I hope you can see that. You see a little tongue and groove on both sides. I kind of push in that prevents one to slide off the other. Usually if you have two 45s, they will swish and slide on you. So this kind of prevents doing so once you add some glue. And overall, it looks really good. I mean, that's pretty tight. So it's toy. Now, it worked really well and the cuts were on the outside really clean. Now, let me explain on that part. When using these bits, you have to run one piece of wood horizontally flat and the other piece vertically. Now, horizontal part is fine. Now, the vertically part, that's where you have the majority of the chipping on plywood. And I believe it only happens on plywood because it's kind of against the grain. There's most amount of resistance and it tears the pieces out. The good news is where it tears out on the inside part of the miter. So if it's a cabinet that you're making with drawers, I'd probably not use these bits. I'd maybe just use a regular miter cut on your table saw. But if it's something like this where you won't be able to see it unless you really climb underneath it, this would work just fine for you. Also, if you have full dimensional lumber or essentially just solid wood, this will work fantastic without any kind of tear outs. Once you've made all your cuts on your router table and ready to assemble, get all the clamps that you have in your workshop and a bunch of wood glue. My go-to is always Titebond 2. When it comes to assembling, it's really easy, specifically the bottom part and then lining the edges or the sides. The hardest part is the top, and the reason why is because everything is like a lock-in key, tongue and groove method. The last piece of the puzzle is gonna have some resistance, so in order to actually get it fit snug, you're gonna have to pull and pry some of the pieces away and then push it all together at once to kind of hug together. It takes a little bit of an effort. Don't get frustrated, but when it does come together, it's so cool seeing all the edges line up perfectly. So I am sanding the plywood right now. This is maple ply, it's finished grade, so you gotta be very careful. The veneer is not very thick on top, so what I like to do is I just use the 150 grit sandpaper to get rid of as much of the glue that's still left on the residue. Smart choice would probably have been just to take a damp rag and wipe it off while the glue was still settling, but we can't be perfect. Anywho, I'm gonna tackle that on. I'm gonna pray that I'm not gonna take off all the veneer, and then we'll do some wood filler on things that, didn't come out so perfect. After everything was sanded smooth, I then did a dry fit and then looked for any imperfections that are there and patched them up with wood filler. I'm no saint, sometimes these things happen, and fortunately enough, we have things to fix it with. Once it's done, I then traced the legs exactly where the Lego chute basket would go. Once I traced it out, I then accounted for the 3/4 inch wall. Then I used my new Ryobi brushless drill and driver combo set to create the holes, the pilot holes in the corners, and then I used my jigsaw and then cut it out exactly how it needs to be. A little pro tip, you can use that same drywall speed square if you want to kind of help guide the jigsaw to make as smooth and of a straight cut as you can. Now for the actual assembly of all the components, I'm using wood glue first to set the tabletop to the legs and then the legs to the base. Once the glue actually dries, I'm then using a ton of L brackets. Now by ton I mean 8, so essentially 4 for the top and then 4 for the legs. If I was to do it again, I could probably use double that. And the way I kind of mounted them is first I did the legs to the tabletop underneath. You can't see them, which is awesome. And then the legs to the base via the inside part of the legs where the Lego pieces would go. And it just does a fine job. My kids are 3 and 5, well, almost 6. And I just know they're gonna climb on this thing and it's just destined to break if I don't put these things in. For the actual finish of the project here, I got the project down to 150 grit. Sometimes you can do 220. In fact, sometimes I think they recommend that. I'm using a product by Minwax called Weathered Oak. It's one of my favorites, not to mention my wife's. 2 coats is what I used for application. It's really easy as well. You can use a foam brush, which is probably my favorite. I was out of foam brushes, so in this situation, I just used a rag, which turned out just fine as well. So I got this really decorative piece from my local hardware store. It's a trim piece. It's, I want to say it's, well, it feels like pine, but it's nice. It's got these little squares on it to match the feeling of a Lego brick set. So while the stain is overall drying here, this is the trim part that's gonna kind of encapsulate or trim out the opening where the Legos will go and hold the mesh basket that holds the pieces from falling down. So I'm gonna put a coat of stain on it. Once it dries, I'll miter it up and trim it all out. Now for the actual mesh sack that will hold the Lego pieces in the middle, I found this Delicates bag at my local Walmart. It's like $2 to $3. It's super cheap. It's 15 inches in diameter and then the depth is about 25 inches deep. Once I measured the amount I needed, I cut out the waste and I secured it in place holding with the trim pieces and then secured the trim pieces with a brad nailer. And it worked out really well. And then the rest of it that was sticking out, I cut the excess off with a really sharp utility knife blade. I took my time not to cut too much, that way not damaging the veneer, and it was just a nice, good, clean, flush cut. Now, of course, for the finish, I'm using, like always, a water-based polyurethane. It's a satin, so you don't get too much of that gloss on it. I'm applying using the HVLP sprayer from HomeRite. There's no diluting that's needed. It's just kind of plug and play and shoot. It worked out really well, and I applied about 4 coats, knowing that my kids are monsters, and they're gonna do everything they can trying to destroy this. And finally, once the clear coat was dry, it was ready to install the Lego base. They're 10 by 10 pieces. I got 8 of them. You can buy them online or at your local stores for roughly around $6 a piece. I'm installing them using liquid nails. This stuff is tough as nails. You got it. Just a quick application, and I made sure to just keep the symmetry of it using like a level. So basically the thickness of my level is from the edge, and then I just made sure everything was square down the middle as can get. And overall, it turned out really good, guys. Really proud of this. Well, that is it for me this week. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching this video. If you guys like these kind of videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button right over there. We put a video out every single week. We don't want you to miss a single one. If you're brand new to the channel, we have a couple of other videos right over here for you to check out and let us know what you think. Tune in out this week. We'll see you guys next week. See ya. Bye.